Welcome, students, to another week of lectures. This week, we're going to be on Chapter 5, which is Civil Liberties, Civil Rights, actually, and what civil rights were. Last week was Civil Liberties, where we touched on what government can't do to you. This week, we're going to talk about civil rights, what government must do to protect you and your rights. So as we begin, I have PowerPoints. This week's PowerPoints are not as long as previous versions of the PowerPoints, because I feel like when I went over civil liberties, I kind of went over some of the civil rights issues. So we're gonna, so you might run into terms that we went over last week, which is okay, and that's fine. As we talk about civil rights, and which is about inequality and equality, we're going to look at civil rights in action. One of the things when we think of civil rights in action, we think of Rosa Parks, and we think of Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus. And when most people think of Rosa Parks, we think of, most people don't realize Rosa Parks wasn't looking to be arrested that day, even though she was a member of the NAACP, she was a secretary. That particular day, she was just tired from a long day of work. And just that day, she decided not to give up her seat to a white man. And we have to remember, Rosa Parks had been trained. You got to understand, people, there was a concerted effort. Rosa Parks was the perfect person to refused to give up her seat that day. She's not the first person who did that, but she was the perfect person, being that she was a married woman. She was about middle age. Rosa Parks was probably almost 40 when this happened. So she was married. There was a young woman prior to her. I believe her name was Claudine Colbert or something, and she was unmarried and she was pregnant. And she refused to give her seat. Well, that wouldn't play well in the media, because as we know about America in our media, we tend to focus on, they would focus on the fact she was pregnant and unmarried, having a bastard child, and they would on the fact that she was refusing to give up her seat. So Rosa Parks, she met the criteria that the NAACP and SNCC and the Southern Leadership Conference, those type of organizations, they were constantly looking, they knew they had to wage a war in the media more so than anything. And Dr. King and the early civil rights leaders who took up Rosa Parks's cause were probably knew that. They did know that. Dr. King knew marching and nonviolence would get further than people in the street having a civil war in our streets. It's just, I mean, if we look at movements today, or some people call what's going on in Israel and Palestine, people would argue that if, some people argue that if the Palestinians would take a more nonviolent approach, they would get more sympathy from people. But as long as you're taking up arms and you're killing people, then it's hard for people to want to sympathize with the cause. And I've heard people say that. So MLK and those guys studied Gandhi and Gandhi's approach to India winning freedom from the British Empire. Well, the same thing would apply here. With King and these guys knew that with the Soviet Union professing to be anti-Christian, but also the Soviet Union was not just only anti-Christian, the Soviet Union was also was very much in favor of this concept of everybody being equal in society. Everybody from the janitor to the head of the country, in theory, were on the same level playing field. There was no hierarchy in a communist system, which we know that's not true. If you look at former Soviet leaders, somebody had to live in the Kremlin while somebody lived down the street in a one-bedroom apartment. And the reality is there's always going to be a hierarchy and a structure when in any system, but it plays well in a society that professes that we're all equal. How was the United States telling communist nations that they're oppressing people when you are oppressing people in your own nation? So MLK knew that fighting this in in the media on TV is to the benefit of Black people in other marginalized communities getting these rights, getting their civil rights. So when we talk about civil rights, what do civil rights mean to you? So I want you to just take a moment and just to think about what they mean to you, because we have a concept of civil rights in our society. When people hear civil rights, they automatically think Black people. That's the first thing people think, Black people. Civil rights are about Black people having equal rights. So that's true, but there's more. Civil rights are not just about Black people. When we're talking about civil rights, we're talking about Asians, we're talking about LGBTQ, we're talking about our Latinx, Hispanic brothers and sisters who are fighting every day for their rights, and not just them, but Muslims, right? People, we look at, we see, we deem the poor is an issue of civil rights, is a civil rights issue. Being poor in America is a civil rights issue. So when we look at all this, we only see it from one lens, Black and white. No, civil rights is about any group that's marginalized. Poor people are marginalized. And guess what? Every American in America, every group in America has poor people. So that means even white people are marginalized, because if they have no access to healthcare, to quality food, good school systems, and there's places in America, Appalachia, where there's about 30 to 40 million Americans, mostly entirely all white, who live below the poverty line. And so therefore, that's an issue of civil rights, okay? And I just wanna make sure we're clear on that. We know when we talk about civil rights, Black people, we know that, but we got to look at other groups. We got to understand Native Americans not having access. It's a civil rights issue. And so we have to be very aware of everyone in our country. Everybody has civil rights and they can be violated. So when we talk about civil rights, we're going to talk about some terms and concepts. When we talk about civil rights, it's the protections against unequal treatment that government guarantees to all groups. Plain and simple. So these protections, we all are guaranteed protections by the government, and government must protect us from certain things. Like, you know, we should all, and this is all theory. We know America is not a nation built on equality. We already know this. And there's been reasons why America has not been built on this concept of equality, because race plays a factor into it. How one looks, right? That does matter. Race does matter. Race is the first thing you see when we deal with people who are, when we recognize. It's funny because we were, and I want to be very careful when I talk about this, because I know it's hard to talk about race in America, but it's something we must talk about, because we like to pretend that racism is over. We know that's not true. And in the 80s and 90s, we went through this concept of I don't see color. I don't see your color. Nowadays, if you say that, then you're saying you don't see me. But back in the 80s and 90s, and this is where people have to understand, some people still believe that concept because that's what was drilled in our heads in the 80s and 90s. I don't see color. Well, now in the 2000s, and as we turn into this new century, now when somebody says I don't see color, you're literally saying you don't see me. And then I will be offended, right? And I'm upset because you don't see me, because you're saying you don't see color. We have to understand, people at one point were told to be colorblind. That concept was a concept that was pushed, that we need to be colorblind. The reality is we can't be colorblind, because if I were to rob you, any of you right now, first thing out of your mouth is you say he's Black. That would be the first thing you would say. And we need to be honest about that, and not deny our differences. It's okay to be different. I'm okay. And I'm also okay that Santa Claus isn't Black. Okay, there's just some things we know. Okay, so I'm okay with that. It doesn't make me feel bad because Santa Claus is not Black. I just want us to be honest about these differences that we have. And it's okay to be different. It's okay to talk about our differences. Now, there's things we do have in common, and I would argue to anybody, I would say go to a foreign country where you don't speak the language and run into an American of a different race. You will find very quickly how much you have more in common than you don't. It's only when we're here stateside that we tend to have this concept that we're more different, and when in reality we are actually more alike, especially culturally, because there's things we have that's been embedded into us by our culture that we're all just alike, and we do. And America's built on this concept of individualism, when in reality a lot of us are not individualistic. We're more alike than we are different from everybody. Now, again, my skin color is black, and we need to be honest about that. And being a black man in America, there are some downsides to that too. And we got to be honest about that. We can't just say, oh no, this Professor Ken has every benefit in the world. I do have some privileges thanks to my education, thanks to what I do for a living. There's some privileges that come along with being academic, but also there's some disadvantages of being a black man in America. So when we talk about privilege, there's more than just white male privilege. There's many different types of privilege. There's privilege that come along with wealth and having money. There's privilege with type of job you have. If you're a doctor, there's going to be some privileges that come along with that, right? But being a white male in America in 2021 is I guess the top of the hierarchy in our society. Now, this is what I want to make sure I make clear to everybody. None of us should feel bad for the privileges that you have, because it's not your fault. You were born into a system that is built like this. My only thing is, I tell people, when you get into positions that you are blessed or lucky or whatever you want to look at it to have, be the change agent, be the person that makes a difference. Don't just go along to quote to get along. So we have to be a part of that change, because America is constantly transitioning and growing. We're not the same country we were 250 years ago. We're not the same country we were 150 years ago. We're not the same country we were 50 years ago. Heck, we're not the same country we were 10 years ago. A lot has changed in 10 years. So we have to be mindful that we're always changing. Now, are we going to be the change for good? Or are we going to be a change for not so good, for bad, evil? And that's something we got to take into account. When we talk about ethnicity, ethnicity is socially constructed, it is, and it's based on classification of people based on their national origin or culture. So when I say ethnicity, I'm saying something along the lines of Mexico and El Salvador. Though somebody who's Spanish from El Salvador and from Mexico, that's an ethnicity difference. Okay, that's the difference between ethnicities. And their cultural differences. Most definitely, if you can go to all the Central American countries and Mexico, and you'll see the different. The way they make tamales might be different. Heck, in Guatemala, a Guatemalan tamale and a Mexican tamale are two different tamales. And I like both, so I'm not going to even get into that discussion. But I lived in Guatemala for a year, so I have experience living in Guatemala and then being raised here in Southern California. Mexican culture or Spanglish culture tends to we're taught a lot, so we understand some of the things that because California used to be a part of Mexico. Remember the Mexican-American War, when the United States had a war with Mexico and took California, the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Utah, and it became part of the United States of America due to manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is this concept that God has given Americans the power, the authority to conquer the North America from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And understand, that's also why you had the War of 1812. So manifest destiny plays a part, and as well as when we talk about these different issues of America and how it has progressed through time. And then we talk about gender. When we talk about gender, now gender and sex are different things, right? So, and I'm just gonna read the definition out of the book. It's a social relations between the sexes, attitudes about how sexes interact and the roles that society assumes they will play. So gender is also a socially constructed concept. What men are supposed to do, what women are supposed to do. Those are different. And some people tend to self-identify, and that's okay, right? I'm not going to get into arguing over the issue of transgender, if transgender men and women are real men, and that's, save that for the biology class, and that's your own personal opinion. I subscribe to the idea that if you're a student, you're my student, and you're transgender, and you are born female, and you transgender to a male, I will call you by the name you asked me to call you by. I will call you, if you tell me to call you Jeff, and you were born Jessica, your parents assigned you the name Jessica at birth, and you transitioned to Jeff, you will be Jeff. I'm gonna call you by what you want to be called. Again, because these are your rights, and no one should take your right away from you, how to self-identify. And it also applies to people who might identify because on an experience. Barack Obama self-identifies as a Black man. Yes, his mother's white, and I know some people like to say, well, he's biracial, but he self-identifies as a Black man. Meghan Markle identifies as biracial, and so that's their right. That's how they self-identify. It's not my place to tell anybody how to see themselves. Their experience is their experience. Your experience is your experience. And then, so when we talk about these different, in America, we had different categories, and throughout history, we had different categories. If you go, there's another part to this table in the book, and I just used just from 2010 to 2020, and you do see some differences. Back in 2010, we didn't ask white people to specify further nation of origin. So you could be white and are Hispanic and be considered white, or Hispanic and be Black. I'm Black, I'm non-Hispanic. So you see these things trying to change over time. Also, American Indian and or Alaska Native, they will ask you for tribal information. If you go back 50 years, they didn't ask you that. And also, if you go back, I was telling my in-person class last week, my grandmother was colored, my mother was Negro, I was born Black, and my son is born African American. You see the change of the classification over time. And those are things that the government did and still do to this day. When we talk about civil rights, we're changing terms and concepts. Forms of inequality. And when we talk about forms of inequality, we're talking about forms of opportunity, forms of inequality in opportunity, and inequality in outcome. When we talk about opportunity, we're talking about a form of inequality in which laws of or official action deny specific groups social, political, economic benefits that are available to other groups. So laws are put in place, Jim Crow laws, and every, we got to remember the North had laws too. There were laws in the North. Jim Crow was just so prevalent in the South because they were so blatant and in your face. When we talk about inequality of outcome, the outcome is a form of inequality in which social and demographic forces, not official laws and policy, cause one group to enjoy more political, social, economic benefits than another group. America has always done this, even to the point where you'll have one group say, well, the reason why that group doesn't have what I have is because they did not work hard. No, sometimes that's not what it is. There's some people who work, there are people who are poor who work hard every day and still don't do still don't have the same outcome, still don't have the same opportunity. So we have to be mindful of that. We have to be mindful of privileges that certain groups of people have had. Okay, education is a game changer. I have two parents who were college educated. It was a game changer. It was. I have a different life because of education was important in my family. For some, yeah, and again, remember what I said earlier. Education is a privilege. There's privileges that come along with education, and it's true. It really is true. We got to be honest about that. When we talk about segregation, segregation is done in two ways. One is de jure segregation, and de jure is like physical segregation of groups that results from law. So those are things that are codified in the law books. De facto is a physical separation of groups that is not legally sanctioned or imposed by the government, but stems from individual preferences and economic forces. So sometimes individual, others, a lot of times economic. Banks tend to do things where, and it's been shown, data has shown that banks will, good example, a black and a brown person and a white, let's say black, brown, and white male go into the bank. The black and the brown guy will get a loan for less money, but a higher interest rate. The white guy will get a loan for less interest rate, more money. So the black and the Hispanic guy will get a loan for $200,000, $300,000. The white guy will get a loan for $700,000. The black and the Hispanic guy will probably pay 16%, while the white guy pays 2%. Now, let's stop and think about that. When you're looking for a house and you have $250,000, $300,000, and you have $700,000, where's the $700,000 guy gonna go? And where the $200,000, $300,000 guys don't go. And this is where you'll get people living in certain communities. And that's a form of redlining. I'm gonna redline you into only a place that you can afford. And so when we're looking at de jure and de facto, de jure again is codified. It's in the books, it's on the law. Jim Crow was in the books, it was on the law. De facto is just out of practices. And either it's gonna be self-preferences or it's gonna be done, it's still gonna be done. It's just not on the law books, but it's done in practice by things like banks. So, and think about this, so now let's go one step further. The white guy, the black guy, and the Hispanic guy. The black and the Hispanic guy have to live in a certain neighborhood, and their homes, all of their homes, all three of their homes, is going to have property tax. The property tax goes into the school districts. So if you have a house worth $700,000, you're going to pay a little more property taxes, even though you're paying less and you're paying less and you're paying more in property taxes, but you're paying less of an interest rate. Don't forget that, because it's what the data has shown. You can look it up. It's very easy to look up. Google is your friend. And the government does studies on this stuff, but not just government. Every major university, Harvard's done studies on this. Yale, Princeton, name it, Stanford, USC, UCLA, they've all done studies on this where they have shown that when you're in a poor community and you own a home, you spend less on property tax. And so that means less goes into your school district. Well, the school district with more money going into it, they have better programs, college prep, anything. We have a program with the local college where the students can take college prep courses. They've been doing that for a long time now, and I'm sure there's some schools that are starting to do these programs. But if college is not something of a priority at a school, because it's not something they talk about, because they're trying to get these students to go to trade schools, and this is a practice that was done for a long time. If you're in a poorer community, you're going to have auto shop, home economics, something like that. If you're in a wealthier community, you're going to have CIS courses and more STEM courses. And so these are things that are done, and they're done very de facto. There's no rules to it. That's just how they do it. And so when we're looking at civil rights and civil liberties, there's civil rights, again, is not just about Black and white people. It's not just, it concerns all of us. Everyone has civil rights. And no, and let me say this, when it comes to religion and civil rights, the Christian faith is not being attacked in the United States of America. And I'm saying this as a pastor. It is not being attacked in America. It's not. And so civil rights in regards to the Christian faith are non-existent, and I'm gonna tell you why. The federal government in Congress, over 90% of your congressmen, 97% of Congress, people in Congress are religious. They subscribe to some religion. 90% of them subscribe to Christianity. So tell me, how is government, the government that is run by Christians, oppressing other Christians? So that's a non-existent argument that I hear a lot. And so your religious rights are not being taken away. What's happening is rights maybe that your religious group don't agree with, and I'm not just talking about Christianity at this point, don't align with this group, other group that's been marginalized. And I would say to those people whose religion or belief system philosophy doesn't match up with this group over here getting their rights, I would just say, I'm sorry, you know, you cannot, your belief system should not infringe on anyone else's rights to believe and do what they want to do, as long as they're not harming anyone else. Because not everybody believes what you believe, and that's what everybody has to understand. Not everybody prays to the same God that you pray for. Not everybody goes to the church or the temple or the mosque or the whatever it is, or outside into the mountain. Everybody doesn't do that. So everybody doesn't believe what you believe. So therefore, that's why we have an idea of separation of church and state. The state is supposed to be separate from the church. Thomas Jefferson knew what he was doing when he pushed that idea, this concept. And I would suggest everybody read the Jefferson Bible. There's an actual Bible called it's the Thomas Jefferson Bible. He wrote one. And you'll be surprised to find what's not in there. Anyway, I just wanted to say this is the lecture this week on civil rights and civil liberties. I want you to have a safe week. Take care. As Porky Pig says, that's all, folks. Bye-bye.